The Orioles have added another player to the mix of potential utility infielders. So, how will they use that spot in 2026? We'll talk about that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, February 4th, 2026, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to talk about the Orioles picking up infielder Bryan Ramos in a small waiver trade with the Chicago White Sox this week. Talk about how Ramos could fit in with the Orioles if he sticks on the team, and kind of where he fits on this run of potential utility infielders for the O's. Is that spot locked up for Jeremiah Jackson, or could someone else fall into the mix? Or could the Orioles maybe reconfigure the roster using Coby Mayo and Ryan Mountcastle in a different way? But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. It's the last call for football on FanDuel. If you're a new customer, bet just $5. You'll get $200 in bonus bets if you win. So let's start with the roster moves that the Orioles made earlier this week, as they have acquired infielder Bryan Ramos in a small trade with the Chicago White Sox, sending some cash back over to Chicago in the deal. Now, it was announced as a trade, and technically it is, but really this is just a glorified waiver claim, something the Orioles have done before. Ramos, who was designated for assignment by the White Sox last week after they signed former Orioles Seranthony Dominguez to a 2-year, $20 million deal. And sometimes, even though the Orioles aren't too far back on the waiver wire because it goes in reverse order of record and they won only 75 games last season, they apparently did want a chance of getting Ramos and felt like teams worse than them would easily put in a waiver claim for him. So you can jump the waiver order by just trading for a guy. Most teams do this by offering up some extra cash to the team that put the player on waivers. They get to jump the waiver order. And if they offer the most cash, they end up being the team who acquires the guy. So the Orioles did DFA Weston Wilson to make room on the 40-man roster for Ramos. Obviously, when the O's claimed Wilson off waiver from the Phillies a couple weeks ago, I told you he will be DFA'd in a couple of weeks, and that is what happened. Orioles will hope that Wilson clears waivers and can stay in the organization as utility depth, which we'll get to in the second segment. But who is Bryan Ramos, who the Orioles have now added on this just waiver train that they continue to roll through this offseason? Well, he's a 23-year-old third baseman, although he does turn 24 in March, just before opening day, and was originally an international signing out of Cuba by the White Sox back in 2018. So this will be the first time Ramos is in a different organization. He was a guy who hit well throughout the minors, was a pretty well-regarded prospect until 2024, when he got to Double-A and struggled a little bit, and then got to Triple-A for the first time and struggled a little bit as well. But even with that, the White Sox were a historically bad team. As we remember in 2024, a lot of people got a chance to play, and Ramos was one of them. So even though he wasn't lighting it up in AAA, the White Sox needed an infielder, and on May 4th of 2024, Ramos was called up to make his major league debut. And he stuck with the White Sox for most of the month of May and wasn't very good, went back down to AAA, but he came back up as a roster expansion call-up for the White Sox again in September. And although he was terrible in May, he had a 99 WRC plus in 60 plate appearances in September. He was essentially a league average big league hitter at age 22, which was a really good sign for what he could be moving forward. He hit for some power. He walked a ton in that month of September. I think the White Sox really liked what they saw. He showed a really good 46% hard hit rate. He didn't chase a lot. The bat speed was above average. He squared up the ball pretty well. Like, he looked really good for his first full month as a 22-year-old in the big leagues. Now, he did not make the team out of camp in 2025 and was sent back to AAA to begin the season. And all the good stuff that ended 2024 didn't really come with him in AAA in 2025. He had just a 79 WRC plus and over 400 plate appearances in AAA Charlotte. It means it was 21% worse than a league average AAA hitter. He hit for a little power with 16 home runs, had a solid strikeout to walk rate, but he hit just 216 he didn't hit the ball as hard in AAA as he did in the big leagues the year before. He still wasn't chasing, was showing a good batter's eye, but he just was not impacting the baseball enough like they were used to. He was once again a September call-up, but he was only up in September for about half the month. He played in only 4 games. He got only 12 big league plate appearances with the White Sox in 2025, and that was also his final year with minor league options. So going into this offseason, the White Sox knew that, hey, he couldn't just be freely sent up and down. He'd either have to make the team out of camp in 2026 or they'd have to place him on waivers. And the White Sox got kind of a head start knowing that he was not in their roster plans for 2026, and they ended up sending him on waivers, and at the very least got a little cash from the Orioles back for him. Now, defensively, he may truly be a legit big leaguer on that side. Eric Longenhagen, prospect analyst over at FanGraphs, rated him a 70 grade defender on the 20 to 80 scale at third base, talking about how he already looks like an elite defender and could be even better. Now, his StatCast defensive metrics were kind of average to slightly below average in his, about 170 innings defensively in the big leagues in 2024, a little better in the very small playing time he got in 2025, but I'd maybe chalk that up a little bit to big league debut jitters. He still looks like a really good defensive third baseman when he's down in AAA, and that's something that easier translates to the big leagues sometimes than the bat does. He's also played a little bit of first base, a little bit of second base, and a little bit of left field as well in the minor leagues, which gives him some versatility. And he showed off some speed when he was in the big leagues in 2024. He was 86th percentile in the majors in sprint speed, which gives him another tool to look at. And, after a solid 2024 getting to the big leagues, he was the number 10 prospect in the White Sox system at FanGraphs with a 45 future value put on him to begin the year. Eric and James Fagan wrote up that system report. And the write-up was that, the swing is maybe a little too long. He really struggles to get to high fastballs, especially up and in. So there's kind of a giant hole in his offensive approach. But because of the defense, because he showed some ability to have some plate discipline, still looks like a potential big leaguer. And again, is only 23 years old, so still some room to grow. Now, he has had some injury issues the past few years as well. Groin, quad, elbow stuff is all cropped up and put him on the minor league injured list. For me, for Ramos, nothing super stands out. I mean, the defense is his best tool probably. Nothing crazy stands out. But he is still only 23 years old and really was a well-regarded prospect there the entire time he was in the White Sox system. Never really like a top 100 guy, but a good, solid prospect who most people saw as a future big leaguer. And he has debuted already, so he got to that point. The next step is, can he stick in the big leagues with the team? And he's still only going to be 24 years old this year, which tells me there's some room for him to get better. If the Orioles can fix something with that swing, I think with the defense and the speed and the plate approach, he projects to be a solid big leaguer. And he really reminds me of kind of a Ramon Arias type player, right? Who is, his defense is always going to keep him there. There's a good approach in the bat. It's maybe just going to be a roller coaster of getting going. But if he can get going, he can kind of carry your offense for a couple of weeks and can still be a solid contributor off the bench. Maybe he's never an everyday player, but potentially a guy who you like to have around and who can help you. Now, the thing is with Ramos, like pretty much every other position player the Orioles have claimed on waivers this offseason, I've said it time and time again, the same thing when I do these episodes, they are going to DFA Bryan Ramos at some point this offseason. He is another guy filling in that final spot on the 40-man roster, and the goal here is the same goal it's been with all these guys. You pick them up to get them on the 40-man, you designate them for assignment the next time you find somebody else on waivers that you like, and you hope that a player like Bryan Ramos ends up clearing waivers, that no other team claims him. If that happens, Ramos will have no choice but to stay in the Orioles organization, but will no longer count against the 40-man roster. So even though he is out of minor league options because he's off the 40-man, he'll be a minor league player at that point, and he can begin the year in AAA Norfolk as depth for the Orioles while they work on the swing and potentially be able to keep him around in 2026, and maybe he can be an option for the O's at some point. That's the plan with everybody. That'll be the plan eventually with Ramos when he does get DFA'd, but another interesting guy. And I think it's just a little higher level of interest on Ramos rather than the other guys this offseason, because most of these guys we've talked about, John Kenzie Noel and Weston Wilson and Drew Romo and others, they've just been straight up waiver claims. The fact that the Orioles jumped the waiver wire, gave up some cash, made more of a quote unquote trade with the White Sox to really seek out Ramos and get him, tells me that they're into him a little bit more than they are those other guys. So even though he will also be put on waivers, just a name to watch maybe a little bit closer than the other guys on that list. But speaking of the other guys on that list, a lot of them could fill into potentially a utility infielder role for the Orioles, a role that is somewhat up for grabs, I think, heading into opening day 2026. Who will claim that role on the team? I mean, Jeremiah Jackson feels like he's the front runner, but there are other options out there, and we'll talk about them coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. It's the last call for football on FanDuel. One final Sunday, one last kickoff. The final chance to get in on the action before the NFL season officially comes to a close. This is Super Bowl 60, and FanDuel is making sure you're right in the middle of it with a special offer just in time for the biggest game of the year. Whether you're backing the favorite, riding with the underdog, or building one last same-game parlay, whether it's the Patriots, whether it's the Seahawks, this is the game everyone has been waiting for. And if you're a new customer, bet just $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. So make it count, because after the Super Bowl, the season is over. It's the last call for football on FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of Super Bowl 60. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. So for the Orioles, we talked about them adding Bryan Ramos to the 40-man roster and becomes another guy potentially in the mix to be the utility infielder for the 2026 Orioles. Jorge Mateo had his option declined, is an Atlanta Brave. Ramon Arias was traded at last year's deadline. Then he was non-tendered by the Astros. Arias is still a free agent at this point of recording here on Tuesday, February 3rd. And it's still a possibility maybe that the O's would bring Arias back, but he's not on this roster right now. And that means the guys who up until last year's trade deadline, who kind of served as the utility roving infielder for this Orioles team for 5+ years, essentially, are no longer here. And so they're turning the page to kind of who could fill that role next. And most people, including myself, see Jeremiah Jackson as the front runner for that role, right? Jeremiah Jackson came up right around the trade deadline last year, and he flashed some good stuff. He was amazing in August. He cooled off in September, but still played most days and ran a 117 WRC plus in his first 2 months of his major league career and seemed like a guy who could stick with this Orioles team. And he absolutely is the front runner for that role. But there are other guys in the mix. So Jeremiah Jackson has minor league options and is on the 40-man roster. Bryan Ramos is the other one. He's out of options, but is on the 40-man roster, although he will not survive the offseason on the 40-man. And then you have Weston Wilson, who's kind of in DFA limbo right now, as we just talked about. If he clears waivers, he would be out of options, but he would no longer be on the 40-man roster. You have Jose Barrero at AAA off the 40-man. You have Luis Vasquez, who we saw some last year, at AAA off the 40-man. And then you have Peyton Eales, who the Orioles acquired from the Twins in the Alex Jackson trade earlier this offseason, who's made it to AAA but has not yet made his big league debut. He is also most likely going to be in AAA. So I just wanted to parse out those 6 names who right now may be in the mix to be a utility infielder for the O's, because 5 of the 6 have big league experience, and the one in Eales has been in AAA now. So they're all potential possibilities to help the Orioles as a utility infielder. So I just kind of went like tool by tool that I think could be important here and tried to give out who is the best. So starting with kind of who has the most power at the plate, I would go with Jeremiah Jackson. He's probably got the best raw power tool of all these guys as prospects. He had a 170 isolated power with 5 home runs in the big leagues in 2025. We saw the pop he has in his bat. You look around, like Weston Wilson can certainly hit one out, and Bryan Ramos can certainly hit one out, but I would give the slight edge to Jackson. Best plate approach I'd probably give to Bryan Ramos, who we just talked about. Like, he's always run these really, really low chase rates, does not swing outside the strike zone, has a good feel for the zone, always has throughout the minor leagues, and even showed it when he was at the big league level over the last 2 years as well. So I'd give him a slight edge. Who has the best hit tool, the best at making contact? That has to be Peyton Eales, who the Orioles got in the trade earlier this offseason. He rarely swings and misses. He combines a really high walk rate with a pretty low strikeout rate. He always has, even through AAA, coming through the minor leagues. He's an interesting hitter. He's a smaller guy. He's a different kind of approach, but definitely has that best hit tool. Speed, best speed on the team. Like, Ramos has flashed some good speed. Barrero has flashed good speed. I would give a slight edge to Peyton Eales as well. He had a 60 grade speed right now because he's still considered a prospect, still being in AAA. There's multiple guys. It's not like anybody is a burner like Jorge Mateo, but probably a slight edge to Peyton Eales. Who plays the best defense at any single position? You could argue Ramos with the way he grades out at third base, but I haven't seen as much of that. I would give it to Luis Vasquez. Just the way I've seen him play shortstop, both at AAA and at the big leagues with the Orioles after they got him in here in 2025. Like, Vasquez impresses me a lot with his shortstop defense. One of the reasons why he spent a good chunk of last season, even though he wasn't a starter, just like on the bench on the Orioles big league roster, and why he's still here as a part of this conversation is because he can really pick it at short. For me, that would be the best defender. Now, sometimes a really important thing for a utility player is who has the most defensive versatility. It's one thing to be really great at one position, but can you play a major league level defensively at multiple different positions, which is the big part of being a utility guy? I would probably give it, honestly, to Jose Barrero. He's a guy who the Orioles brought in on a minor league deal last season and spent basically the whole year in AAA Norfolk with the O's, although he's been in the big leagues with the Reds and the Cardinals at different times since all the way back when he debuted as a top prospect in 2020. But in his big league career, he has played shortstop, second base, third base, center field, and right field. And I think he has a little left field experience in the minor leagues as well. But Barrero, being the only guy on here, has played both shortstop and center field in the big leagues, the two, most important defensive positions besides catcher. That makes him, I think, the easy choice for positional versatility. Now, again, Jeremiah Jackson can play the infield and the outfield. Weston Wilson can play the infield and the outfield, but none of those guys are shortstops, right? Jackson and Wilson and Ramos are all third basemen, really, and they're all corner outfielders that they play out there. Barrero, meanwhile, with shortstop plus center field, that's a different level of positional versatility. Most MLB experience also goes to Jose Barrero. He's got 478 big league plate appearances dating back to when he debuted with the Reds in 2020. That's almost a full season of playing time in the major leagues, and that well eclipses really what anybody else has on here. Although I also split out to a different category, which is who has the most kind of recent chunk of important big league playing time. And I would give that to Weston Wilson. Orioles brought him in off waivers from the Phillies a couple of weeks ago, and he's been a solid part of the bench of these Phillies teams that have gone to the playoffs each of the last 3 years, and Wilson's mostly been on the postseason rosters with these teams. Now, he's been coming off the bench as kind of a platoon guy, pinch hitter, doesn't start a lot, but that's good experience to have. He's hit lefties well. He's got the most important playing time because he's playing in meaningful games when he's out there. Last category would be who's had the most successful MLB experience. It's got to be Jeremiah Jackson. It was only 2 months of a season, but he posted a 117 WRC+. He was 17% better than league average in his first 2 months of the big leagues last year after being awesome in AAA. Weston Wilson has a 109 WRC+ in his career, so you like to see that. I mean, Barrero has the most time, but he's been awful as a hitter in the big leagues, which is why he's now back in AAA at this point in his career. Like, Luis Vasquez didn't really hit in his cup of coffee. Ramos, again, didn't hit a ton in his cup of coffee with the White Sox, and Peyton Eales still is yet to debut. So I think that's got to go to Jeremiah Jackson. And for me, that still means the best fit is probably Jeremiah Jackson. But we all kind of knew that, and then he got his chance with the Orioles last year. So just how well of a known quantity is he for the Orioles? He leads in that category as well. But I think that exercise showed that there are some other options besides Jackson, because Jeremiah Jackson has flaws. Like, there's a reason why he was released by both the Angels and the Mets in the minor leagues before coming to the O's and finally making his major league debut. There are a ton of flaws in his game. They could show up if he comes back to the big leagues in 2026. Pitchers adjust to him. You could easily see the offense going down, and there might be other skills the O's are looking for more, like Jackson can't play shortstop. Maybe the Orioles want a utility guy who can play shortstop if they need to. Maybe they want a left-handed bat instead of a right-handed bat. There are other things that they're going to look at here. So if the Jeremiah Jackson thing doesn't stick, there are other options in the organization for the Orioles, even if they don't bring back someone like Ramon Arias. So the bigger question, I think, now is, what will the Orioles do with that Ramon Arias roster spot, right? It's been his forever. It then transitioned to Jeremiah Jackson for the last 2 months of last season. Will it stay with him? Will it go to a different utility guy? Or will they do something a little interesting with all of their first basemen? Let's talk about that to finish off the show coming up next. So my first opening day roster projection, my only one so far of the offseason, was back on January 1st. And in that projection, the Orioles had already signed Pete Alonso, and they still had Coby Mayo and Ryan Mountcastle, two more right-handed hitting first basemen on the roster. And as soon as the O's signed Alonso back in December, me and many others talked about how it's going to be really tough to keep both Mountcastle and Mayo on this roster alongside Alonso. And the thought was, hey, they're probably going to trade one of Mayo or Mountcastle this offseason. And as we sit here on February 3rd, we are a week and change away from pitchers and catchers reporting. Both of those guys are still on the Orioles roster. And that doesn't mean they can't be traded between now and opening day. It's still a definite possibility. And I still believe one of them will be dealt before the Orioles open the season in late March. But right now, we're getting so close to guys being in Sarasota that you have to operate off the assumption that they're both going to be here until we see otherwise. And so that begs the question, what would the Orioles do with their roster? And that is where this utility infield spot comes in. Because when I did my first roster projection, you have Colton Cowser, Taylor Ward, Tyler O'Neill, Dylan Beavers, Leody Taveras. Those are your 5 outfielders on the roster. Samuel Basayo, Adley Rutschman, your 2 catchers, and 4 infielders that are going to play every day: Pete Alonso, Jackson Holliday, Gunnar Henderson, Jordan Westberg. That is 11 of your 13 spots you have on the roster for hitters. For me, that gave you 2 spots left. I gave one to a utility infielder, and I did project Jeremiah Jackson to make the team. And then for the other, it was basically down to Mountcastle and Mayo, and I essentially had to assume they'd both be here, so I gave the spot to Mountcastle because Mayo can be optioned to AAA, Mountcastle cannot, so it allows you to hold on to both players in the organization. Maybe Mayo gets some more work offensively or learning a new position back down in AAA, and maybe you continue to find a way to trade one of the two to open up more spots on the roster. But I kept saying there's no way they can roster all 3 of Alonso, Mountcastle, and Mayo. But maybe they could, right? I was having a conversation on Blue Sky at one point with Dan Sanchez, who has a lot of Orioles thoughts, who brought up this possibility. And I started looking a little more into it, potentially. Again, I still think they're going to find a way to trade Mayo or Mountcastle, but you're not just going to trade them just to trade them. They're guys who can still help your team. And if you're not going to get anything back, they're not guys you're just going to deal to get rid of. You want to get something legitimate back. If you're going to trade them, that means there's a possibility they are both with the Orioles still when we get to opening day. Now, again, Mayo could easily, as I projected, just go to AAA. He could continue to work on the offense. He could maybe do a lot more work at third base defensively. Like that was his position. Then the Orioles in 2025 just decided he's a first baseman. We don't like the defense at third. And I get it. The defense at third was rough to watch, but you didn't know you were going to sign a legit first baseman in Pete Alonso to a 5-year contract. And then you did that, and you're like, well, that makes it harder for Mayo to play. Maybe we try and move him back to third base and at least make him serviceable over there. Maybe we move him into the outfield, right? If he can potentially play right field, especially we know how much Tyler O'Neill is probably going to get hurt. Taylor Ward's a free agent after this year. There are questions about Colton Cowser. There could be playing time out there, maybe more than in the infield for Coby Mayo in the outfield if he could learn that position. I think he has the arm strength and the athleticism to be able to play right field. The question is, have they waited too long? Is that a change he can still make? I believe in him as an athlete to do that, but the Orioles really haven't showed any signs that they're willing to do that until some potential murmurs this offseason that they might be thinking about it. So if you do just, send Mayo down there to get some work, you keep Mountcastle. In that case, you have a spot for a utility infielder, and I think Jeremiah Jackson showed enough last year that he would get that final spot. He can play outfield and infield, and it helps you out. But there may be a way to roster all 3 of Alonso, Mountcastle, and Mayo, because even as good as Jeremiah Jackson showed he was last year, there are flaws. The approach is not good. He doesn't walk. He strikes out a lot. He swings and misses a lot. Anything on the outer half of the plate, when I did his season review episode, we talked about he can't get to. He whiffs a ton and makes soft contact outside part of the plate. Major league pitchers, after seeing him, they are going to adjust here in 2026. They are going to attack him in those ways, and we don't know if he's going to be able to adjust back again. There's a reason why he was released by the Angels and the Mets in the minor leagues and never really made it above Double-A until figuring things out somewhat with the Orioles last season. And on the flip side, even with how bad Ryan Mountcastle and Coby Mayo were last year, you can make a strong argument that both Mountcastle and Mayo are going to be better hitters in 2026 than Jeremiah Jackson, and the projection systems would all back you up. Like the biggest one over at FanGraphs, Steamer projections for WRC Plus in 2026 has Coby Mayo at a 104, Ryan Mountcastle at a 102, and Jeremiah Jackson at a 92. That's a significant difference between Jackson and the two first basemen. And plus, again, all of them are right-handed hitters, and Jackson, along with Mayo, does have options where he can just be sent to AAA Norfolk. So you could make an argument that why don't we just have our best bats on the bench? And if you project Mountcastle and Mayo to be a better hitter, each of them, than Jeremiah Jackson, which again, last year Jackson was better, but all projection systems say he'll be worse than those two, then it's a possibility you could just send Jackson down and you could roster all three of Pete Alonso, Coby Mayo, and Ryan Mountcastle. You'd have those 11 kind of lock players I talked about, and Mayo and Mountcastle would be the other two who make your team on the bench. And then you would argue, Connor, isn't that too many right-handed hitters? Doesn't that give you not a lot of defensive versatility on the bench? Because Mountcastle can only play first base. And, Mayo could maybe play third in a pinch because that's his original position, but it's not good over there. And the Orioles kind of gave up on him on there, and he hasn't done work in the outfield. And that's a good argument. That was kind of my argument. It doesn't give you any defensive versatility off your bench. But here's how I see it, right? Pete Alonso at first, Jackson Holliday at second, Gunnar at short, Westberg at third. I don't think these guys are platooning. I think that as long as those guys are healthy, that's your infield pretty much every single day. Sambo Basayo and Adley Rutschman, are splitting catching time. They're each getting some DH at-bats. You're probably going to get Tyler O'Neill in there with some DH at-bats as well. And that would still leave some at-bats as DH for Coby Mayo and Ryan Mountcastle. There'll still be some in there. But if you want to go to a bat on the bench, pinch hitter, whatever it be, maybe late in the game, those two would be potentially project to be better options than Jeremiah Jackson. And hey, maybe with Craig Albernaz in the fold, who's done a great job working with defense, mostly catcher defense, but he's got other people on that staff with him. Maybe they believe that Coby Mayo, with some more work, can turn back into at least a serviceable defensive third baseman if you have to put him there. You still trust him more defensively at first rather than third, but you can get him to a point where if he needs to start one game, play 3 innings here or there at third base, he's not going to kill you over there. Maybe you can pretty easily get back to that point. And maybe if he's in the big leagues, mostly on the bench, it gives him more time pregame work to just continue to work and work and work defensively at third base to get to a level where you can trust him a little bit more over there. Now, the main concern for this roster alignment would be Mayo, technically a third baseman, but he's bad over there. It leaves backup infielder. What happens if one of Holliday, Henderson, Westberg gets hurt in a game? You've got no one to go to, right? If you have Jeremiah Jackson, he can cover third base and second base. Westberg and Holliday can both cover shortstop if you need to. If Henderson went down, it puts you in a fine spot. If you don't have Jeremiah Jackson, and instead Mountcastle and Mayo are filling those final 2 bench spots, if you can get to the point where you can stomach Coby Mayo at third base for, 5 or 6 innings or something after an injury, you can do this. Because if Holliday goes down in a game, you put Mayo at third, move Westberg to second. If Henderson goes down, you move Holliday to short, Westberg to second, Mayo to third. And if Westberg goes down, you just insert Coby Mayo at third base. And if the injury is serious, if a guy needs multiple days, if a guy gets hurt and needs to go on the injured list, then the very next day, you just call up Jeremiah Jackson or whichever utility infielder is your guy of choice. If you need more of a shortstop instead, you go to Luis Vasquez instead of Jeremiah Jackson or whoever it may be. And, even if it's one of those situations where, Westberg tweaks his ankle, he doesn't need to go on the injured list, but he's going to be out for 4 days. So we have to option someone. Well, you could just option Mayo, or maybe you have to option Dylan Beavers, or maybe you're in a good spot with pitching and you can option a reliever for a couple of days and carry 14 hitters for a little bit to get you through that. Also, Tyler O'Neill is going to be on the injured list here at some point. And you will probably, as the Tyler O'Neill replacement, if you do begin the year with Mayo and Mountcastle on the roster, say it's April 20th and O'Neill's making his first IL stint, you can just call up Jeremiah Jackson to be the O'Neill replacement because he gives you now a utility infielder on the roster again, and B, he can also be a right-handed bat who plays right field, which is what O'Neill does. So it kind of covers 2 holes on the team for you if you just put Jeremiah Jackson up there, not if, but more so when Tyler O'Neill goes on the injured list for the first time. But again, if it's an injury to a guy and Mayo can fill for 5 innings, the very next day you call up one of these Jeremiah Jackson, Luis Vasquez types. And if Jackson's going to be on the 40-man already, it makes it very easy to just get him to Baltimore and get him on the roster. So it's maybe a little risky for one game at a time, but in a 162 game season, I think that's a risk you're willing to take. And it's a similar thinking about, we've talked about the Orioles potentially carrying 3 catchers this offseason because they might want to have Basayo and Adley in the lineup together a lot. That makes you maybe want a 3rd catcher. Again, if one of them gets hurt and you can spare the pitcher hitting for 5 innings of one game, you can get another catcher up to the team the next day, and it doesn't really hurt you as much over a 162 game season. It's similar thinking. Now, I still would rather probably have the other infielder like Jackson on the roster, and I still think the Orioles are going to do their best and still make a deal to move either Mayo or Mountcastle before opening day. But I see the argument and the vision and the way that both Mayo and Mountcastle could be on this roster along with Pete Alonso, and wouldn't really be shocked if the Orioles find a way to do this, at least to start the season, and then kind of see where it goes, see how healthy they are, and see how Tyler O'Neill fits into this health-wise again. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know here in the comments. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Let me know what you think. Would you be okay with the Orioles not having a utility infielder and doing that plan with Mayo or Mountcastle? Or would you rather just send Mayo to AAA and make sure there's a backup infielder on the roster at all times? Also, if you're a listener, make sure to follow the show, subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. That really, really helps us out. And if you have any questions about the O's, you want to talk some ball, mailbag question, whatever it may be, you can always email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. I'll be back tomorrow. We've got a few more players to finish off our season review series. Let's talk about Brandon Young on tomorrow's episode. Had 2 of the coolest moments of the year, the immaculate inning and the almost perfect game. Other than that, he wasn't that good. So I'm going to try to dig into a weird rookie season for Young and what his role, how he could potentially help the Orioles in 2026. That's coming up on tomorrow's episode. And if you're liking what you're getting here at Locked On Orioles, remember the Everydayer Club is there for you. Maybe it's built for you. You can get Locked On Orioles ad-free, members-only Discord access, and more. Just head to lockedonorioles.supercast.com. That link's in the show notes as well to join the Everydayer Club. Back tomorrow for another episode, as we are back to 5 episodes a week this week. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.